one suggestion if we cannot resolve that issue, though, and that would be that Michael sends either I or you, Greg, his presentation, and then we can do it sort of manually for him while he presents. But I guess we'll see what happens when he comes back on. All right, well, so hello, everybody. Welcome to the Environmental Issues panel for our Peace and Hope in Dark Times conference. We certainly need some hope for peace in these dark times. So presenters, you have 25 minutes each total allotted time. As I said, what we're going to do is actually go through each of you for 20 minutes to complete your paper. Then we'll open up the whole floor to discussion at the end. I will give you a 5-minute warning in the chat. So keep your chat open. I'll just write 5, and that means you've got 5 minutes left. Okay, so today we have 3 fantastic speakers. Kelly Colbe, Professor and Chair of the Philosophy Department at Baldwin Wallace University, just outside Cleveland, where I understand you are heavily involved in the university sustainability program there. Then we have Chaitanya Motupalli, who got his PhD in ethics and social theory at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, with a specialization in environmental ethics. And then we have Michael Lucas, hopefully, who is an architect turned academic teaching at Colbe. It's a great panel, and I don't want to waste any of our time. So first up, we have Kelly Colbe presenting the ethics of migration in a climate disruptive world, sourcing the love of place as necessary to motivate efforts to conserve and protect our local and regional ecologies and the communities at the front line of those efforts. So please take it away, Kelly, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Will. I appreciate the introduction. And okay, I'm just trying to, good, I got the slideshow going, I think. So I'm just gonna start reading. This is a bit scattershot. It's not the polished paper I was hoping I'd have, but let's go for it. So the world is becoming increasingly closed or inimical to migration, even as climate change is projected to displace startling numbers of people over the next 30 years, and continuing, of course. Amid warnings that hundreds of millions more people may become permanently displaced due to rising sea levels, floods, droughts, famine, and hurricanes, walls, barriers, and border controls are multiplying, giving rise to a profound structural injustice on a global scale. At the front lines of the forced global migrations are the so-called disappearing states, the Pacific Island nations currently being swallowed by rising seas. Migrants from these states will never be able to return home, and thus may require permanent, or they will require permanent resettlement. Countries with high density populations in delta regions, such as Bangladesh, Guyana, and Vietnam, are also threatened by large-scale displacements due to rising sea levels. In other parts of the world, most urgently in the African Sahel, drought and widespread crop failures have spurred millions of rural people to move to coasts and cities. These developments have inspired debates in policy circles over the most appropriate international legal framework for protecting the rights of those displaced. Some scholars have called for a new protocol to the 1951 Refugee Convention, recognizing the subcategory climate change refugee. Most scholars reject this approach, in part because one does not become a refugee until after extreme weather events have already struck or islands and coastal regions have already been flooded. Citizen groups in Kiribati and Tuvalu have rejected the title refugee, since they seek active participation in the decision-making processes that will determine their fate, and they're hoping to avoid getting to the state where they become refugees. Other scholars have advocated for the creation of a climate displacement coordination facility under the UNFCCC treaty process to oversee planned voluntary resettlements and protect the rights and cultural identities of those displaced. There had been talk of such a facility in discussions leading to the Paris 2015 climate change conference, but there's no reference to such a facility in the text of the Paris Agreement. Still, other scholars have proposed a standalone UN convention, distinct from both refugee law and the UNFCCC process, reasoning that, quote, the problem of climate-induced migration is sufficiently new and substantial to justify its own legal regime, instead of being forced within legal frameworks that were not designed to handle it, unquote. Still others have advised against developing any single legal instrument dedicated to climate-related displacements, since, quote, decisions to move are often compelled by underlying interrelated conditions of poverty, environmental degradation, socio-political factors, and the adverse impacts of climate change, making it difficult to disentangle precise motivations. An important implication of the latter position is that considerations of climate justice may be virtually impossible to disentangle from other pressing justice issues, particularly in the case of people movements. Nevertheless, in writings in moral philosophy, as well as in IPC assessment reports, climate change-related migration is typically treated as a matter of climate justice under the rubric of adaptation, as a policy response to climate change that, in interaction with mitigation, raises important considerations of global and intergenerational justice. Philosophers examining climate justice issues characteristically adopt an ideal theoretical standpoint, a standpoint that looks at what a maximally fair arrangement would look like on the assumption of widespread agreement on the rules and high levels of compliance. Such an optimally just arrangement might never be realized in practice, but offers a normative target to aim for. As we might expect, philosophers have taken diverse and conflicting positions on climate justice issues, each of which has been subject to forceful objections. In addition to the persisting disagreements in ideal theory, there is the problem of what David Miller very influentially has called the feasibility constraints that social conditions in the real world impose on principles of justice that can justifiably be advanced. With respect to global and intergenerational climate justice, we live very much in a world of non-compliance, indeed of non-compliance with impunity. Accordingly, many scholars insist we must start with the institutions that actually exist and their potential for reform or transformation through real political action. A further difficulty confronting discussions of climate justice is a tendency to frame them in abstraction from other issues, a defect especially apparent in the case of climate change migration. As we have seen, decisions to move are motivated by a diversity of factors, among which the adverse impacts of climate change play a greater or lesser role. Sea level rise threatening SIDs, small island developing countries, are at one end of a continuum, and even this relatively straightforward scenario does not occur in a void, but against complex histories of colonization, exploitation, and coercive trade policies. In other cases, the role played by a hotter climate is even more densely entangled with other factors. Most people move to escape poverty or violence, and each of these push factors raises important ethical challenges of its own. I refer to, it's well known that Syria, for example, the conflict in Syria seems to be rooted in droughts leading to urbanization and unrest, right? And you can also trace similar dynamics to the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Libya. How useful is the climate justice paradigm for assessing, for example, the European response to the influx of migrants brought by the wars that followed these events? With reference to the US southern border, how should we account for the statistical surge of migrants from the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador starting around 2007, which was around the time of the Great Recession? These are some of the poorest countries in Latin America, with the majority of migrants heading north in search of work. Roughly half of all Guatemalan children under the age of 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition. And Guatemala ranks 9th in the world for, quote, level of risk to the effects of climate change, in large part due to its expanding corredor seco. So that was the image from the Medina Tahrir in Egypt. I spent 4 years over there in Egypt before the Arab Spring events. So here's an image of the corredor seco. Flight from poverty makes one, in legal terms, an economic migrant, not someone to whom a US immigration judge is likely to grant asylum. And this circumstance wouldn't change with Biden's comprehensive immigration bill, the US Citizenship Act of 2021, assuming it could get passed in Congress. Recently, the devastation wrought by Hurricanes Eta and Iota triggered a caravan of more than 9,000 migrants from Honduras, about 100 of whom were met with tear gas and struck by Guatemalan police with batons about 2 weeks ago when trying to pass through a roadblock, a consequence of Trump's asylum cooperation agreement with the Northern Triangle countries and Mexico. How much moral weight should we give our own country's cumulative emissions when formulating a response to this crisis and in our immigration policy more broadly? How should we balance our country's collective historical contribution to a hotter climate in which droughts are more severe and hurricanes more frequent and destructive, with the fateful role played by US trade policy, the US war on drugs, and the ubiquity of American guns in Central America? In other words, the climate justice paradigm may not provide us the kind of help we need when we're dealing with these ethical issues associated with climate displacements, but migration more broadly. What moral and legal categories should apply to these Hondurans composing the so-called caravan? Are they environmental refugees, in deference to the hammer blows of the two hurricanes? Honduras suffers from high rates of violent crime, and the pandemic has crippled the Honduran economy. Could increasing the number of H-2 guest worker visas in for Central Americans help these migrants? To what extent would doing so amount to meeting an obligation of climate justice? How should the US go about addressing, as Biden has promised to do with his allocation of $4 billion over 4 years, the root causes of the migration? Discussions of US immigration policy contain few references to assisting these countries' efforts at so-called adaptation, which is a climate justice category. Climate justice principles seem to offer little guidance in the real world of bilateral and multilateral agreements on trade, security, or development assistance. The very category adaptation, with its evocation of new technologies and improved agricultural practices, obscures the massively integrated character of any viable adaptive response to climate disruption, which would have to incorporate economic justice, social equity, human development, inclusive governance, urban regeneration, and post-materialist, non-consumerist values. An ethical treatment of climate-induced human displacement also requires sensitivity to the dynamics of climate communication. So we typically hear projections about the numbers of people who will be displaced by climate change in a specific rhetorical context, at least in media discussions, namely raising the alarm and mobilizing public support for the energy transition. Those are laudable goals. I'm an alarmist myself about climate change. But the unfortunate consequence of that narrative is to make national security considerations salient when we're thinking about these displacements. Australians reading a 2012 report in the Sydney Morning Herald with their coffee or tea in the morning, reading about a mass wave of climate refugees seeking a new place to live, would have been unlikely to react in the first instance with compassion, but rather with fear and a desire for stricter border controls. Climate change poses an urgent human security threat, and as we have seen, it has credibly been linked to violent conflicts, speaking of those wars in the Middle East, for example, but it principally poses a security threat to those most vulnerable to geography and poverty. The fear, widespread among members of wealthy countries, that climate change will bring a destabilizing influx of migrants to their borders is profoundly irrational, a product of sensationalist reporting and xenophobic symbolic politics. I note the irony that Rust Belt cities along the Great Lakes, including Cleveland, where I'm speaking from, are at this moment marketing themselves as climate havens, making efforts to attract water-intensive industries from water-stressed regions, as well as immigrants to work in these industries. So most American cities need more, not fewer, immigrants. Talk of climate change causing a vast remapping of the world's population, obscures the fact that the overwhelming majority of climate displacements, an estimated 143 million over the next 30 years, will take place within national borders. Most of this displacement will consist of flight from rural to urban areas, contributing to a global trend of rapidly expanding urban spaces. Abraham Lustgarten, reporting for the New York Times, cites the ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, estimate that 96% of future urban growth will happen in the world's most fragile cities, the poorest cities, and refers to a 2018 study according to which fully a quarter of the world's population will live in slums 10 years from now, 2030. That's 40% of all urban dwellers. The single most salient area for effective moral response to climate migration, then, is a credible global effort to achieve progress on UN Sustainable Development Goal number 11, quote, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The fundamental problem is sprawl. Sprawl looks very different in poor areas than in affluent ones, but in both contexts, the solutions are similar. Laws regulating the development and use of urban land, the promotion of vertical growth, complete streets and multimodal transportation, and the development of circular economies, greener economies. Climate adaptation is principally about designing regenerative cities, and an ethical solution to climate displacements must focus principally on the challenges associated with rapid urbanization. It remains true that resettlement is a large-scale phenomenon posing urgent ethical challenges, regardless whether caused by war, poverty, or climate change. The UNHCR estimates that there are nearly 80 million displaced, of whom 26 million are refugees residing outside the borders of their country of origin. Of that group, roughly 60% move to urban areas with limited aid from the international community, where 15% live in planned and managed camps. The other 40% live in rural areas and for the most part in some kind of camp setting. That's quoting Serena Parek, who's done work in this area. While a majority of the displaced are eventually integrated into cities, a significant number are contained in camps where they remain for an average of 17 years. An ethical response to climate change migration must therefore reckon with the gross human rights violations associated with what scholars call encampment, as the use of camps as a long-term measure for containing those forcibly displaced and denying them basic rights and political participation. Subject to arbitrary control by a nexus of governments, NGOs, and international organizations, those living in the camps are reduced to a condition Hannah Arendt has called mere humanity, rather famously, Giorgio Agamben, bare life, and Michel Agier recently, a state of liminal floating. Philosophers Matthew Gibney, Michel Agier, and Serena Parek have made important contributions to formulating pragmatic ethical responses to this phenomenon. But such a response also has to treat encampment as part of a larger system of border control by which destination countries are successfully circumventing their legal obligations of non-refoulement regarding asylum seekers. Encampment is a byproduct of the diversity of strategies that Aristide Zolberg has named remote border control, including interdiction at sea, offshore processing, and bilateral and multilateral agreements with transit states to apprehend and detain migrants well before they arrive at one's territorial boundaries. In Sheila Ben Habib's words, these distance-creating strategies, quote, undermine processes of democratic accountability and legitimacy by removing, literally and metaphorically, from the public's eye, the measures exercised in their name. And I thought that Tina Thaw's discussion of incarceration and the issues of freedom of speech there would be very relevant in this case too. So the border practices arguably lack democratic legitimacy, but they also clearly violate the basic rights of those seeking access. But now we're confronting this problem of weighing the rights of migrants and refugees with the sovereign right of exclusion, allegedly fundamental to a people's collective right of self-determination. So we can make, again, if we're talking about an ethical response to migration in response to climate disruption, we've really got to come to terms with the problem posed by a sovereign people's right of exclusion. How do we clarify the limits of that right? Obviously, that's a tough problem. My own opinion is that Shayla Ben Habib's approach is one of the more promising ones. She's trying to find a way to weave the legitimacy of boundaries together with the importance of protecting universal human rights and protecting the rights of refugees and immigrants. So that's an area that I discuss next. I look specifically at Ben Habib's notions of democratic iterations and the related idea of disaggregated citizenship. Basically, Ben Habib is arguing that human rights discourse is beginning to, as it were, infect social movements and political discourses within democracies. And part of that dynamic has to do with people's increasingly multiple allegiances across and beyond various borders, right? So we're dealing with a kind of new multiculturalism that's changing discourses within democratic polities. Admittedly, there's a huge nationalist backlash too. And so part of the issue is how do you balance all of these dynamics that are now animating democratic politics or the politics of democratic republics. So I'm really interested in what, sorry that noise is happening. I'm really interested in what Shayla Ben Habib then is trying to do. But there's a further issue. So, Ben Habib is working within a broadly Kantian tradition. She uses discourse ethics also to articulate her ethics regarding borders, exclusion, and the rights of entry. Again, I think her idea of a relational cosmopolitanism, as she puts it, or a cosmopolitan interdependence is very important. Her idea of relational sovereignty strikes me as promising. But there are also issues when we are looking at environmental philosophy. And so one of the areas I'm interested in looking at, so 5 more minutes, that's not too, I'm done.
Binding, yeah, Fred. So, but if you could just, you can try and wrap it up just very quickly.
Yeah. So I'm also interested in a parallel debate running in environmental circles, primarily this valorization of the bioregional versus efforts to develop what Ursula Heise calls an eco-cosmopolitanism. So personally, I'm committed to Heise's eco-cosmopolitanism. I think that's a fruitful way to go. It's a less anthropocentric approach than we get with somebody like Ben Habib. I also, however, find the appeal to a bioregional politics very difficult to ignore. I do think that the liberational potential of a bioregional politics is also of vital importance when we're dealing with these issues. So what I'm trying to do is figure out how we can sort of, resolve that conflict, the prima facie conflict between an importance of the bioregional as the proper scale of political activism, identification, community, with these problems associated with people movements and climate displacement. So that's the paper I wanted to give today, but I thought some of these preliminary, what I really was just trying to do in the comments preceding was to suggest that maybe the climate justice paradigm, which has merit and is very important, is not the most important or most useful paradigm to adopt when we're struggling with these issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you. Very, very interesting, very important paper. And I think you're right. We're already seeing some important overlaps with some of the other presentations. And I think that pattern will probably continue with Chaitanya Motupalli's presentation, where he talks about how the relationships between climate change and violent conflict. So again, sort of, negotiating these overlapping fields of theoretical concern. So in the spirit of preservation of time, we'll just go right into it. So Chaitanya, please give us your paper on climate change and human security.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Kelly, for this opportunity. The topic for my paper is climate change and human security. We all know that we are experiencing the impacts of climate change, and the perception about climate change is also changing. For example, in the US, if you see in 2015, only 62% of people adults believed that there is climate change. But now that has changed. In 2020, we have 72% people or adults who said that they believe in climate change and global warming. So the point is that climate change is a reality that we live in, and we are going to experience the consequences of the impacts of climate change into the future. So today, in the spirit of this conference, my paper is I'm going to figure out what is the best way to approach climate change so as to foster peace. So what I will do in this paper is initially I will see how climate change and violent conflicts are related, how climate change impacts violent conflicts, and then talk a little bit about human security and propose a few thoughts on that. So climate change and violent conflicts. So as I looked at the literature that is pertaining to climate change and violent conflicts, there's a lot of literature, but there are predominantly three views. The first view that I'm going to talk about is the alarmistic view. So Kelly kind of mentioned that in his talk. So in this perspective, what we see is that the alarmists say that, because of climate change, we're going to have wars in this world. The world will become a battlefield. So a couple of examples that I want to bring to your notice are in 2007, the Christian Aid, a nonprofit organization based in UK, said that by 2050, there will be 1 billion people who will be migrating. And because of that, we will have violent conflicts. So that is a relationship they have. Climate change leads to migration, migration leads to violent conflicts. So similarly, in 2003, there is a report from the US Department of Defense. It is called An Abrupt Climate Change Scenario and Its Implications for United States. That report says that the climate change will be so abrupt that will lead to a war. The world becomes a battlefield, they say. So the reason is that because of these abrupt climate changes, there will be a diminished resources that we depend on will get reduced, and that will lead to war. That is the conclusion they draw. So however, the point, I don't really buy into this, because at least the way they present it, even though that is the reality, the way they present it is very reductionistic, and also it is very simplistic. There are many more factors that come into the picture when it comes to violent conflicts. So I'm moving on to the next view that I have found. So the next view that I found is a very optimistic view. So there are people who are saying, what, climate change is not necessarily something that will lead us to war, but it is an opportunity for countries or states to come together for peace and for cooperation. So this is a Professor Eric Gartske from UC San Diego. He makes very interesting connection between global warming and interstate conflicts. He says, he looks at the later half of the 20th century. And during that time, what happened was we have a lot of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. And during that particular period of time, the number of conflicts that we have had has reduced drastically. So he makes this interesting connection and says, what, because of climate change, because of this global warming, we were able to increase the economic development and democracy in this world. And that has led to peace. So that is his argument. Therefore, he says that, what, this is an opportunity that we look at. We should look at this as an opportunity for peace and international collaboration. And that is his perspective. There is another think tank in Berlin, which is run by Alexander Carius. He says, it's not just climate change which will lead us to peace, but even the environment itself, the whole environmental problems will lead us to peace building and conflict resolution. The reason why he says is that the problems that we see because of environment or pertaining to the environment, uh, the difference is this, that it doesn't consider the political boundaries or geographical boundaries. Everybody will have to experience these problems, and it will bring together governmental and non-governmental organizations, and it will help people to build economically, and it will bring together people. That's what his argument. Therefore, he says ecological problems create opportunities for peace and cooperation. So the problem, though, for me is that this kind of view seems to avoid the problem completely and kind of not touching why or how climate change impacts us and how they lead to violent conflicts. So I move on to a different perspective. This is a realistic view. So as I told you, there are multiple views in this world and in the literature right now and the academy, where people are not able to come together on why or how climate change is impacting the violence in the world. So taking this seriously, Stanford in 2019 brought together 11 of their most influential scholars and experts in this field. And it asked them to come together and figure out, well, assess this problem and tell how is climate change impacting violence. So they came together, 11 of them, and then they said that, they have reflected upon the previous 100 years and then saw the interstate violence. And then they said that climate change is not a big factor that has contributed to these violence. It is mostly poverty and the poor governance that has contributed. However, they add that it will be a risk for armed conflicts into the future. And I do believe that that will be the case into the future. So if you want to read it, the paper is called Climate as a Risk Factor for Armed Conflicts. So that is the view I take, and that we are going to see more of this violence in the future. But how does climate change indeed impact violent conflicts? So that is the question that I want us to ask. In order to think about how can we foster peace, I want us to answer this question. So there are two, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it says that climate change indirectly impacts and contributes to violent conflicts, because it will amplify the well-documented drivers of conflict, such as poverty and economic shocks. Therefore, it will contribute like that. Similarly, when we talk about migration and all, that will contribute to territorial integrity. So therefore, and it also contributes to the disruption in the infrastructure of any state. Those things might lead to violent conflicts, IPCC says. Similarly, two political geographers, John Burnett and Neil Edgar, have a similar kind of analysis. They also say that because of climate change, it will lead to vulnerability of people, and there will be impact on water availability, and there will be an impact on agricultural production, and because of the extreme events and diseases and all, people will their livelihoods will be weakened. Therefore, that might lead to violent conflicts. And as I said, poverty is a big factor in this, and also the political system that we live in. Those things also contribute to violent conflicts. And Kelly kind of mentioned it, migration is a big part in this. So when people migrate from one place to the other due to ecological reasons and climate change, that might be a contributor to violent conflicts. So I'll give you one more analysis, and then I'll move on to human security. This is an analysis given by a political science professor in Norway called Halvard Buhag and his colleagues. They say that, I'll just read out what is here, and we will move on. So they say that, because of climate change, what will happen, there is increase in natural disasters, and that will lead, and there will be the sea levels will rise, and also that will increase the resource scarcity. Okay, and what happens is, because of that, there will be migration, and that leads to loss of economic activity, food insecurity, and reduction in livelihood, and it in addition to that, there will be poor governance, societal inequalities. So they all contribute to different kinds of aspects that are pertaining to human security, and those lead to increased risk of armed conflict. So this is a very interesting and very important graph that I want to come back to. So, but in now, I want us to go back, talk a little bit about human security and connect these two. So far I have mentioned that there are different factors that contribute to violent conflicts, and the way we can address these conflicts is by addressing the things that contribute to that. So if you look at those things, the things that I have marked here in this red, all these are nothing but aspects that threaten human security. And therefore, my argument in my whole paper is that, you know, if we take a human security approach, which will encompass freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity, and freedom from hazard impacts, then what happens is indirectly we are addressing the risk of armed conflict. So my argument is that we should use this framework to address these threats for human stability, and then we can address or foster peace in this world. So there are a couple of points that I want to make. One is that the solutions that we want to propose for climate change should be people-centered. That is the whole idea of human security. They should not be centered around state or market, but they should be people-centered. That means the people, where they live, how they live, all those things need to be considered when coming up with the solutions for climate change. So I want to read this quote by Barnett, John Barnett. He says, a human security approach to climate change would entail focusing on the effect of climate change on the well-being of people and communities, which may be critically influenced by mediating institutions such as the markets and the state, but which cannot be understood merely by analyzing the effects of climate change on these larger categories. So as of now, what is happening is most of the policies that are being proposed are not necessarily taking the consideration of the people in the communities, but they're based on markets instead. They're important, but we need to consider the people and their status. And a couple of things. One is the solutions to climate change should take the equity issue into consideration. As of now, we know that people are, there is a big divide between in terms of the threats that climate change poses on people. People in some countries, some places like South Asia, Middle East, and the Sub-Saharan Africa, they are worse impacted by, say, people living in the United States. So there is always already that distinction that is there, and it is going to go even the distinction or the it will only increase, it will not decrease. So the inequalities will only be will only worsen as we go forward. So there is a proposal that, you know, we need to talk of the global distribution of wealth and power. We need to move away from talking of how the inequalities related to green gas emissions, from that to how the power and wealth is distributed. Final thought is that the solutions that we give or we propose for climate change should enhance people and should enhance the capacity of people and communities to respond to both change and uncertainty. So climate change will, of course, will lead us to a situation when everything is uncertain, and it kind of puts people's livelihood in danger, and therefore we need to this goes back to what Kelly was talking about, adaptation, and how can we make people be ready or be prepared for what is coming. So whatever solutions that we provide should include those aspects as well. And that is what human security perspective will propose. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aitanya. Very interesting stuff. And I think, again, hopefully in the Q&A, we'll be able to draw out some of the mutual implications of both yours and Kelly's paper, and perhaps Michael's as well. So thank you so much. So up next, we have Michael Lucas, presenting Justice in the Eco-Phenomenological Battle for Cerrito Peak, a case-based investigation of marking a place, guided by a selection of primarily continental theories of place. So, Michael, take us away.
We'll try some, see if I can get my Luddite mindset to use some of this technology here. I'm going to try the desktop, and I'm going to try to make my screen as large as possible. And I'm going to try to go into, so does that pretty much fill the screen for you?
Yes, you are filling the screen, and that appears to be presenting perfectly. So
okay,
take
good.
it away,
I'll try
Michael.
it this way.
Thank you very much.
Well, I want to acknowledge the Yaktichu Tichu Yaktalini and the Te Epotaha'el peoples whose traditional lands I reside, and who each name their sacred place, Eagle Rock, differently, the topic of the paper. And I'm grateful to their preserving and maintaining their cultural traditions and stewardship of the lands and seas of this place. And my almost 30 years of academic work would not be possible without the collaboration and contributions of generations of indigenous peoples across half the continent that I've learned from, and I honor them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what appears in Heidegger's version of the fourfold, some of pieces of eco-phenomenology from David Abram. Morro Bay has 5 gatherings, which are layered and enmeshed histories and life worlds that each reveal and conceal. And then the Eagle Rock Cerrito Peak, specifically with the injunction of the California Environmental Quality Act as a mediator. So place includes conflicting and competing descriptions, what appears between, across, among, immediacy, effect, temporality, reasoned thinking, science. So I'm going to look at this place, Cerrito Peak, overlooking Morro Bay, which overlooks the larger Estero Bay of the Pacific beyond, and this particular view is from Black Mountain. So Abrams says, my life and the world's life are deeply intertwined. The world and I reciprocate one another. The landscape, as I directly experience it, is hardly a determinate object. It's an ambiguous realm that responds to my emotions and calls forth feelings from me in turn. And this is Hofstadter talking about Heidegger. It says, we need to let things be, to let them presence and openness and the full appropriateness of its nature, to hold oneself open to this being. And so that idea of privilege and competing histories and different temporalities conceal and allow that openness. And so since I'm talking about the Chumash people here, this is one of their songs translated into English. The canoe courage, you have the power to succeed in reaching to the other side, that so you may get where you want to go. So where we're going is right here. The Estero Bay is down here between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that was a very wet winter with the Sierra snowpack there. We probably got some snow this week, got about 10 inches of rain here. I'm going to be talking about that red circle again inside the edge of Morro Bay, the city of Morro Bay to the north, the town of Los Osos to the south, the sand spit that separates the sea and Estero Bay from Morro Bay and the estuary. And this is my dog and I on the beach. And one version of place proceeds from that phenomenological awareness, that immediacy apart from concept and precept, away from the thrownness of the dominant culture one comes from, just being with the beach. And so the first gathering I want to talk about is how the Moros got their bay. We have a very distinctive landscape here of these piercings that are a chain of volcanic plugs on a now dormant fault that make their way to the sea from the San Luis Obispo area. This is Black Hill at the estuary of Morro Bay. And this is the final one that emerges from the ocean, called Morro Rock, with the Irish Hills beyond. And the Irish Hills are part of that folded work about 20 million years after that, that helps to form our coast now. And it's still active. This is the earthquakes this month in the region. Whoops, the circle's a little far to the right there. And you can see there's a couple within the San Luis Obispo Morro Bay region there. So the world is actively still creating itself. Sea level rise is nothing new here. The Chumash oral history confirms what we understand from other means, that about 8,000 years ago, the ocean was about 300 feet lower than it is now. And over time, the sand spit formed and the creeks filled in with silt, and created the situation that we have today. And the sand spit is still migrating, as you can see by aerial photographs that we have. So this geomorphology that we see today, well, I'm sorry, the faults are in the center there. There we are, and the folds of the Irish Hills and the sand spit. So this commodification of bay to harbor, the Spanish first anchored in 1587, but it wasn't until the mission period, 1772, San Luis Obispo, about 15 miles away, was founded, and that's where the contact really starts to occur here. And then we go through Mexican independence, the secession to California, and in that transition, Riley and some others established an ambiguity between Spanish land grants and were allowed by the California now courts to establish a town. And so this is the first survey. And originally the rock was isolated out in the water, made it very difficult to get into that harbor they hoped to develop. But by the 1930s, the WPA had closed off the north end of the harbor, and we're looking forward to the commercial fishing and oil industry that was burgeoning. So some of the early pictures from the 30s looking out at the bay. By 1942, the whole Embarcadero, the whole harbor edge had been improved as an amphibious assault training base. And there was some action here during the war. It was a very scary time, blackouts. And the Japanese farmers that had been integrated into the community were sent to internment camps. So at the north end of the picture there is the Naganos family farm, who they continue to work today. Post-war, the federal government turned over all of that to the county of San Luis Obispo, and a commercial fishing became very important. Today, that's still prized but threatened. It's about 15% of the catch of 30 years ago, but we still have working boats. The city has this fantastic storage yard of artifacts of things that may never go out to sea again. The city came because of the revenue from this power plant. Pacific Gas and Electric built this plant here to use once-through cooling from the bay in what was called the wastelands in that original survey. And here you see that 1953 version. A later expanded version was stopped in 2006 because of the once-through cooling debate, as well as economics of that technology. And we have that artifact still here. If any of you have a few $100 million you'd like to throw our way. Vacation destination, the post-war prosperity, growing middle class, roads made this a getaway. Motels became the dominant building type. We have over 30 today. And you can have a kind of Tudor or a kind of Santa Fe look. And then increasingly we're a ghost town. There's over 300 of these home vacation rentals that you can have, and we've just capped the official number. And this is the one available next to me if you'd like to. It's $460 a night though, so maybe a little out of reach. Sailboats have started to replace the commercial fleet. That Embarcadero that the military put together now is lined with restaurants. We have a harbor festival. It's the pre-pandemic harbor festival. And then there's a gathering as an indigenous homeland in Morro Bay here. And here we are in the red circle at the gap between the Chumash and the Salinan peoples. And so California had every place named and many relationships already before that contact. And we had Spanish from the south, the British and Portuguese sailed by the coast, Russians from the north up as low as the Bay Area, and then the Americans from the east. So at the mission time, this is the number of Chumash villages in this area that stretches from Ventura up to our area in the north, and our little orange cross there is where Morro Bay is. So many villages across this area. And the Chumash cosmology looked at this integration of that shaking land and the changing skies and seas in a very beautiful way of a sky world, a middle world, a lower world. And this kind of image of the beach culture and loose arrangements of villages, so they're not a permanent houses, very rebuildable apps made out of tule grasses. So pre-contact about 20,000 people, post-contact about 600. So that's missionization, disease, and kind of erosion in general. And this absorption into ranching culture here. So lots of blended families and ethnicities along the way. And these are some livestock pens of that ranching culture that we have today. So a vague recollection of Chumash culture romanticized here, parking lot in Malibu. But this is the actual culture that's alive today. And there's over 5,000 people that identify as Chumash between here and Los Angeles. And with their story of creation on the Channel Islands, the sea is as important as the land. And so here's the Northern Chumash launching their tomel as they were starting to recreate the paddling out on the ocean. And so to have this kind of maintenance of culture and renew and maintain, you have to, and fulfill your responsibility within that world of caring for place, you have to require access to place. You know, so Heidegger talked about this idea of the temple as a way of gathering what he called the fourfold, deities, people, earth and sky. And his way of thinking, it opens up a world, and there's a unity within that opening. And he also talks about it not so much in that kind of architectural way. He talks about a location can install the fourfold, and even uses the analogy of a bridge gathers things in its own way. And so this idea of something that's cleared but can be freely named within a boundary, and a boundary can be something which begins presencing. And that's the nature of shrines and use. So different places, this is a temporary place, a funerary Chumash ring at Gaviota State Park. The Chumash have some beautiful shrines that are still in use. This is the Painted Cave Shrine in San Marcos Pass that has these beautiful glyphs inside that were evolving over time. They've stopped that at this point. This is one that I take my students to, the Painted Rock Shrine in the Carrizo Plain National Monument. This is about a 300-foot diameter structure there. And there you see it in the center of the picture in the grasslands near the foothills. And this is inside that shrine. And so this is a beautiful room. And at the base of it, you have these glyphs that are a record. So that one in the center there you see is about 24 feet long. And they've been vandalized heavily by gunshots and subsequent chipping, but it's still a record that's intact. So Fred Collins is the Northern Chumash tribal spokesperson, and this from only about 14 years ago. Sometimes people don't understand who we are. We're dealing with a mentality still views us as being dead. So that rock is a Chumash shrine, along with the Salinan people claim it as well, and sits at this focus of the harbor. And the city of Morro Bay, few understand that Chumash presence, despite it's literally under their feet. And so this idea of concealment can come in different guises: intentional, in hegemony, racism; conversely, confidentiality of sources; accidental, blunders. I didn't know that was a site when I dug it up; ignorance, lack of education, interpretation, or public discourse. So generations of farmers here found Chumash artifacts. It became private. People in the 60s started to rethink this, and cultural materials became something that became part of a record. So these are just 5 areas there. I'm going to talk about Eagle Rock in the center. The power plant erased quite a bit of material when it was done, but in the 1960s, when they expanded a parking lot, they found the largest Chumash app ever recorded. This was a site which was part of the primary Chumash village area, and they had a project that was going to use caissons that would dance around the primary sites. Okay, I'll move here a little bit faster. The marina issues there. This is one that was negotiated with a walkway through. So very quickly, Eagle Rock. And the idea that over time, as the town grew, this shrine became impacted more and more. This was a proposed house that was going to be built, and this was all they showed for the Planning Commission. I was not on the Planning Commission at that point. Very obtuse, no other interpretation. This is walking up to that site, which is now more or less a public park because of the unbuildability of it in the past. And this is where the house was going to be built. So probably 50 plus trees coming down. This is the nature of the shrine on the right-hand side that the Chumash and the Salinans both speak to, a point of significance for them and the kinds of views out from the rock. But over time, this has kind of been the first kiss for a cigarette location for a lot of people. Raptors nest in the eucalyptus. We have different species of birds, the wild turkeys, seasonal migration of the monarch butterfly, which is adapted endangered species. The shrine area itself, it's part of this geologic condition. It's very, very friable, a lot of risk of rock drops when something would be built. This is looking from the top of the shrine to the south and the location of the house. So obviously everything's in social media these days. So Save the Peak was put together, as well as They're Stealing My Site was put together. So this kind of bandagement back and forth. This is what I thought was interesting, though. This came from the developer. That's his diagram, and the area of what he thought was a misleading photo, which made it assume his house was going to be built there. So here's his diagram again, and what I did was superimpose with my architectural skills and things from his drawing. Started to superimpose this to show the neighbors where the path of the trees were going to be taken down, so they actually would know that's where his house is, and it is pretty much close, right on top of the shrine, and you would actually see quite a bit of his house from all around the edges. That's where it was going to be built. So the Planning Commission at that time approved it, despite growing opposition. The City Council approved it, and he put it up for sale on his real estate site after that, which I thought was very disingenuous, since he made a very emotional plea about it was going to be his home. So he was taken to court, and there's our ironic Save Tree USA piece there, as all the trees were going to be cut down. 2014, the Superior Court ruled that he must do a full environmental impact. This is something we had asked for, and he refused to do. So now he had to do it, and he passed on. The environmental impact report would have talked about the nature of the sacred sites, found it difficult, if not impossible, to mitigate those, along with the geologic issues and the endangered species. So this group was put together to grassroots create a nonprofit. The estate sold the property to the city. The city said, if you can come up with the money, we'll give it to you and put it in open space. And they reached their goal in 2020. So grassroots conservation effort through that group. And so in fall of this year, the city actually went into a transfer of the property to the nonprofit. So this place-specific intelligence shared. Each place has its own psyche, each sky its own blue. Some of Abram's quotes there. And this piece from the Chumash again, the rainbow reaches up from the earth and goes around the sky. It brings us a promise for the past and the future. There's beauty at both ends. So this kind of continuity of culture still has a trace aspect that's able to be maintained there. And the idea of a battle suggests lack of respect, enemies, and rejection of reality or accommodation. An authentic place in communities, negotiated peace. It accepts that phenomenological immediate, the working pragmatic, the historic and prehistoric as inclusive and complementary. So the past and the future link through that richness in the presence and the presence that it has. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so glad we got your presentation working. That was such a rich and immersive experience, I'm sure, for all of us, certainly for me. So thank you, and thank you all. So what we are planning to do then for the next 15 minutes is just open the floor to various questions. Because this is the webinar, we don't actually have our attendees able to speak directly. So I've been collecting some of the questions that have turned up, and I will ask them to a number of you. So I think I'll begin with a question for Kelly, because a number of people asked a similar question. The question essentially was some elaboration of Ben Habib's concept of relational cosmopolitanism. and also how this connects to your idea of this sort of love of place. So I guess how this concept is going to potentially work for addressing the issues that you think are, insufficiently addressed by some of the climate justice paradigms. And then a secondary question was, is there, how do we navigate that tension between this open cosmopolitanism and the sort of preservation of the relationship of specific communities to their cultures and traditions when they are forced to move?
Yeah, great questions. And I wish I had great answers for them. That's part of what's motivating me to do this work. But, there are preliminary ideas. So, yeah, I mean, Ben Habib uses a lot of angles to get at her idea of a more relational sovereignty, a sovereign interdependence view. There's the normative idea that's kind of familiar in these discussions. Every democratic republic has a legitimacy grounding in universalist human rights discourse, right? It's part of the, you could trace it to writers like Locke, but, and that universalist discourse is already challenging a more absolute idea of territorial boundedness or sovereign exercise over these boundaries. But in practice, she's arguing that we're actually seeing at work in social movements, and this is her idea of democratic iterations, that these universal human rights norms are getting increasingly embedded in the idiom of democratic politics, civil rights movements, and so on, explicitly or implicitly. She also just notes that due to the interdependencies that we actually have to peoples within and outside of our borders, that our allegiances are already becoming diverse. I mean, Biden won Arizona in large part due to the record turnout of Latino voters who were concerned about these immigration issues, for example. So, these allegiances are driving increasingly democratic politics. And she also notes that there are a lot of ways in which citizenship is becoming increasingly disaggregated. And she thinks that these models are very promising. I don't know how much they're really growing, but the Netherlands, for example, immigrants who have 5 years of residency gain city citizenship status, so they can participate in city level politics, run for leadership and so on, even though they're not actually Dutch citizens with full citizenship powers. So, we could displace that model to refugee camps, for example, and that's happening in some areas where they're becoming more like cities, and people are having greater democratic voice, even if they haven't really been nationalized in their the country that they're residing in. Regarding, I think democratic iterations would also be the key to resolving the conflict. I mean, Michael Lucas just gave a really profound example of the importance of these bioregional local connections and cultivating a real knowledge and understanding of the history of these places and so on. And that if people are unable to do that, if we are essentially dissociated from our local places, that there's going to be no hope for a more ecologically sustainable future. That would be the idea. So how do you balance that bioregional politics with these more cosmopolitan ideas? And I think you have to again go back to allowing peoples locally to work through these issues, right? Place is always dynamic anyway, right? Hybridity and migration and mixing, both non-humans and humans, are part of these histories, as Michael just showed us. So, I mean, I think there are conceptual resources, but I would favor a democratic model that gives communities far greater power, control over these questions, rather than larger, more disconnected hierarchical political systems. I don't know if that was helpful.
It was certainly helpful for me. I will check and see if there are follow-ups in the chat. But for now, let's move on to a question for Chaitanya, actually. A related question here is that it's a related question because your model proposes this person-based conception of the role of security, right? Away from the protection of more market-driven ideas. And I guess a related question here then would also be, what is this sort of optimally inclusive conception of the security of an individual or a community that would enable the minimization of conflicts brought about by the number of conditions you suggest or by the inevitability of mass migration?
I don't think I understood the question. Could you rephrase it?
So the question is, your model proposes focusing, who we should be considering, what sort of locus for moral and political consideration, and it should be the security of the person. And I guess my question is just, are we conceiving of this on the basis of some kind of liberal individualism, or are we conceiving of this of some kind of community value, or are you conceiving it in some other way?
Thank you. That's very helpful. So according to the human security discourse that we have, so it basically lets the community decide what values those communities prefer. So it all depends on the communities, the kind of values they prefer. But of course, they need to include basic human rights and fundamental basic needs and fundamental human rights. So those would be that would be the baseline. However, beyond that, it would be the communities that would decide what is important and how can, while also maintaining the overarching goal of reducing carbon footprint, the emissions, or working for climate justice, how can these communities work those things out based on the needs they have? Because every community is different with its own challenges and aspirations. I think those need to be considered.
Yeah, it's something we're all mentioning here. Just the complexity of answering these questions is going to be best served by involving the people in question beyond this perhaps fundamental principle of commitment to human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I thought maybe we could go to Michael now, and I don't know if you see Casey's question in the chat. I'd be happy to read it, but it's quite a specific question. I thought you might want to read it yourself and respond to that one, or would you prefer I read it out?
No, I'll try. I'll put my bifocals on here. As I take it, Heidegger's example of the Greek temple tries to show how the temple itself opens up a world of meaning and thereby reveals what matters for people. Heidegger thinks worlds are historical in nature and can thereby be lost. Do you think that the industrialization you mentioned in the area you focus in has closed off Chumash culture to such an extent that the restoration efforts are in fact opening up a new world of Chumash preservation rather than the primal Chumash culture itself? I don't know. I defer to the Chumash. I think cultural evolution is one of these things that's hard to talk about indigenous peoples, because on one hand you have the remnant of oral cultures that talk about stories and things that every time they're told, they take on a new meaning to those who are hearing it, as well as the way the person who's speaking it talks. So there's by nature an evolution of these cultures, and my sense is that the Chumash are bands. First of all, down by Santa Barbara, there is a band that got federal recognition, and they're recognized and have lands. The other ones do not, and the local ones do not wish to, is my understanding. However, internally, with their own social culture, they've got amazing ideas about farming. That's where we get our local honey. They have all sorts of entrepreneurial kinds of things that have a face to the larger culture, but internally they have their own system of elders and That site that I showed you in the Carrizo Plain, I think is a site of pilgrimage that still goes on. They shut it down under the guise of giving the plain a little bit of time out there, but it's negotiated that they have access to that. And the owner of that site that I showed you here actually had said they would give the Salinan peoples access through an easement to get there. So there is this ongoing aspect of culture. Just because it's not out there, one doesn't see the prayers going on or the meetings happening. It is evolving all the time. And what was beautiful to me was to see them have that access to the Tomo again. I was there when they put that out for that launch in 2007. And you know, the blessing ceremony that went on with that, people are there in their clothes from Walmart, but they've got the same kind of sage that their people have used for generations to bless the boat, and those of us that were there. So it's an amazing thing to see the thread of ingenuity, but I don't think there's any efforts aside from respective cultural resources to change the nature of the way the city does things. The CEQA part and our new general plan that we've just worked on and finished has an overlay inside that owners will understand better that they've got a culturally sensitive, potentially culturally sensitive site when they buy something, instead of finding out when they go to the permit counter, surprise, you have to do $20,000 worth of archaeological work before we tell you if you're going to have a permit. So I leave it up to them. Very resilient people, though, from my experience with them, and beautiful ways they've adapted.
Thank you, Michael. So I think we probably have time for one more question, and one I'm seeing there from Jim, and this is also for Kelly, is whether you see any, I suppose, any calls for optimism in Pope Francis's engagements with the issues of migration.
I haven't been following them really closely. I admire the Pope. The Laudato Si encyclical was really a pretty extraordinary ethical vision. That's not about migration, but broadly, right, about ecological questions. I think his idea about, I mean, it's an idea we were just sort of going over, I think, which is that people need to gain greater proximity to peoples who are being displaced, right? So much of it is about, opening lines of communication and interaction. Most human beings are decent once they are communicating with the people affected. The problem currently is that people are being contained and silenced, or lacking voice in our public discourses. It struck me that the Pope is trying to emphasize, opening communication, I guess, but I haven't been following it really closely. I'll look into that.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, with just a few minutes left, I'd like to take the opportunity to say a couple of things. Firstly, just thank you all so much for such impassioned, well-researched, and vitally important papers, which perfectly suit the spirit and aspirations of our organization. So thank you so much. I'd like to say that I think all of these presentations deserve much more prolonged treatment than we can possibly give them right now. And I would invite you to, there will be an email most likely in a couple of weeks soliciting interest in actually turning your presentations into papers to be published in our annual volume. I don't know exactly when or if that's happening, but I would, request of you guys that all of these presentations serve as the foundation for really, really important pieces that deserve that more prolonged treatment. So I'd encourage you to submit them. And otherwise, thank you all so much. I believe we have a short 15-minute break. And then if I'm right, are we at lunch now, or is there another panel first?